Chapter 7, Tenant-Based Rental Assistance. So again, we look at our chart. We have program-wide rules that are going to apply, and we're going to mention things like the program rule, which was mentioned under rental. But tenant-based rental assistance has some rules that are very specific to that activity. It's dissimilar to most of the other home activities. So TBRA, tenant-based rental assistance, is a rental subsidy program that the assistance goes directly to the tenant, and it stays with the tenant. So the tenant could move from property to property, and that assistance would follow them. So when we mentioned before about project-based subsidies, those are subsidies that are provided to a particular property. They stay with the property, and as tenants come and go, it's who is occupying the unit is going to receive that assistance. Under the home program, the only rental subsidy that we have is tenant-based, and this is where it's provided to that individual household to make their housing costs more affordable, and it follows with them. So this can be used as an ongoing rental subsidy to make those units more affordable, but it also could be assisted for security deposits and utility deposits. It is possible to run a TBRA program where the only thing that you provide would be security deposits, but not the rent. So if the barrier for households getting into affordable housing was coming up with the deposit for that unit, that would be something that by providing security deposits, we could get folks into the affordable housing units they need. That security deposit can be for up to 2 months worth of rent. So what's the difference between a rental project and tenant-based rental assistance? Well, when we talked about rental projects, we were creating funding to create affordable housing units themselves, and not affordable to a specific household, but to sort of a target level of income within the community. So those funds that are provided through rental are either for new construction, rehabilitation, acquisition, and the affordability is set at pre-prescribed rent and utility levels for specific income percentages. Under tenant-based rental assistance, because we're providing that assistance directly to the tenant, it's going to be based on their needs specifically and the unit that they are seeking to rent. It also, as we mentioned before, stays with or is tied with the tenant. And so if they were to choose to move to a different unit, depending on where they went, that assistance could follow with them rather than being tied to a specific unit that they had rented. So the tenant-based rental assistance subsidy levels are based on each household income based on what their needs are. And we'll walk through those, how that calculation is made. So there are a number of approaches that are possible under the tenant-based rental assistance. Many programs are run generally for anyone in the community that is income eligible. We also can target our use of TBRA funds. So it might be paired with a self-sufficiency program. So we have households that have enrolled in this program to work on their job skills and their self-sufficiency. And while they're participating in that program, we could be providing them tenant-based rental assistance to help make that unit more affordable for them. This is one of the cases where we could tie that assistance to participation in that program. So if they dropped out of the self-sufficiency program, they would not be eligible for renewal of their tenant-based rental assistance. We also could provide our TBRA assistance in conjunction with the home buyer program. So for instance, if we had a household participating in a lease purchase program, we could provide that tenant-based rental assistance to that household, reducing their out-of-pocket costs for housing, which would allow them then to be able to save more money towards the purchase of a home. A lot of our tenant-based rental assistance programs around the country are set up in conjunction with targeted populations. So for instance, I might be working with my homeless services providers so that households that are coming out of a shelter setting or a transitional housing situation could be eligible then to receive tenant-based rental assistance for that unit that they move into. And that's a way to help stabilize that population while they gain some self-sufficiency again. It could be also as part of an anti-displacement program in that we have perhaps in a community where we're seeing a rise in rent levels, and so we're having low-income households being displaced because of what's happening in that market. We could make TBRA available within that community. And again, as we mentioned, the security deposit program, where if in your community really the barrier to affordable housing was being able to come up with the required security deposit, that may be a very effective way to stretch those limited resources and serve quite a number of households on that. Some things that we can't do. So we've talked in some of our other sections that when we define home ownership, we've said that in Arkansas, cooperative or mutual housing units are not recognized as homeowners. So if we had someone who was in a cooperative or mutual housing unit, essentially as an owner but not recognized by our program, we could not treat them as if they were a renter and provide them with tenant-based rental assistance. If we had a cooperative or mutual housing unit that was owned by someone else, but a tenant was going to rent that, then we might be able to assist them since they are not the owner of that cooperative unit. Other things that we can't do. So we mentioned in the rental section that if we had a rental funded project under home that caused the displacement of tenants, that relocation was an eligible project cost. So we can't use TBRA to cover those costs. They need to be incorporated as part of that particular project. And keep in mind, we've said that our tenant-based rental assistance funding, it's not tied to a specific project. And so we can't really set that aside in relationship to tenants who are all occupants of one particular property. I mentioned that we can assist households that are moving out of the shelter, but we can't use our tenant-based rental assistance to help offset the cost of housing homeless persons while they're in the shelter or on, temporary overnight housing. That would not be an eligible use. We also have to make sure when we're providing rental assistance under TBRA that we essentially are providing only to the level that a household needs to make that unit affordable for them. And we define affordable as paying no more than 30% of that tenant's income for rent. So if we've got a unit that already has some other project-based rental assistance in place, and they're not paying more than 30% of their household income, we can't add TBRA and make their payment even lower. That would be a duplication of effort, essentially. So for our TBRA assistance, we're going to need to make sure that we have a capable entity that's going to run that. So our eligible recipients for that to operate a program would be an experienced public housing authority or another organization that's partnering with a public housing authority. You'll see as we talk through TBRA, it's modeled very closely on the public housing voucher program, and so it makes sense for them to be run in conjunction with each other. So our TBRA programs are required to adopt the Section 8 voucher program policies and procedures. And the term of these agreements, keep in mind that these are one-year commitments with each household that can be renewed for a second year. And you can, after that has been completed, you could choose to renew for additional years, but there's no guarantee that those home funds will be in place or there'll be adequate numbers to be able to cover that long term. So part of the goal of the program is to think about, what's our exit strategy for these tenants? Will they be able to become sufficient during the time period that we are assisting them with the TBRA assistance? Is there another program that they are on the waiting list for? And we hope that, the exit strategy here is that there'll be another source of funding that will essentially step in and take over at the point that the home funds are not in place. As part of running that TBRA program, you'll have to manage that assistance and think about the number of tenants that you can actually provide for. So if I sign an agreement with a household, I'm signing that agreement for a one-year term, and that term may be renewable for a second year. So if I'm providing them $100 worth of tenant-based rental assistance, that's a 12-month up to a 24-month term. So we've got $2,400 for that 2-year term. So we would have to follow our budget carefully to know how many households can I actually sign an agreement with to make sure that I have uncommitted funds that are actually going to be able to cover those commitments. So some management, some planning and budgeting becomes an essential part of running a tenant-based rental assistance. So who's eligible to actually benefit or participate in the TBRA program? So our eligible beneficiaries have to be low income. So before committing our funding to them, we're going to use our Part 5, Section 8 definition and verify that they qualify. This is going to be done on an annual basis. Keep in mind that income certification is good only for 6 months. So if I have a list of applicants who provide income verification, I need to make sure that that income documentation is no older than 6 months at the time that I actually sign that contract with the household to be able to provide TBRA assistance. And then annually, we're going to re-verify that their eligibility, and we would annually be resetting based on that verified income what their level of need or subsidy would be as part of that. We mentioned as part of those overarching home rules that we have the PJ program rule, which limits for initial occupancy and includes tenant-based rental assistance, that at least 90% of all the rental and the TBRA units have to be for incomes at or below 60%. In many communities, tenant-based rental assistance, partly because of the limited availability of that, are targeted to folks at 60 or below. In some cases, it's targeted even more, even lower incomes than that. So keep in mind that the TBRA program has to remain in compliance with the PJ program rule. There would need to be a written contract in place between the recipient of the ADFA funds who's running that program and then each of those beneficiary households that are receiving that assistance. You would have to have in place a tenant selection requirements in place. ADFA is requiring that you adopt the Section 8 tenant selection procedures, and that lays out your income requirements, it lays out the preferences and how you would decide who's eligible to be able to receive assistance. There is the opportunity to be able to use a couple of options on how that works. You could use the public housing choice voucher waiting list. So you've got folks that have signed up, they're income eligible, but there's not currently an availability for that housing choice voucher. So if we use that waiting list and we provide them with the TBRA assistance, they don't lose their place on the PHA waiting list. And so that's really our exit strategy in this case, that at the point that their TBRA funding ends, we're hoping that they will come up on that list and be able to have a longer-term PHA Housing Choice Voucher for them. Alternatively, you could establish your own waiting list, and that needs to be part of your program design. For eligible units, well, the units have to have a reasonable rent. As we mentioned, we can't duplicate rental subsidies, so if it's already affordable, we're not going to be able to provide them with tenant-based rental assistance. These units could be publicly or privately owned, and they could be home-assisted projects. So when the tenant goes to look for available units under the TBRA program, there might be an ADFA-funded rental project in the area that has an available unit. That's fine. This is a tenant-driven program, so they can select any unit that's available that meets this criteria. The home-funded rental project will have affordable rent. It might not be affordable for this household, and the TBRA could assist based on their specific needs, based on their income, could assist them in making that affordable for them. We can't, since we talked about this being tenant-based, we could not create a TBRA program and say, this is only for our home-assisted units in our community. That's not how this works, but a tenant could select a home-assisted unit if that happened to be one of the available units. Now, the home program itself has some rules about portability. So if we have a tenant in a TBRA program that moves outside or moves within the PJ's service territory or moves outside of that, under the home rule, they could be eligible to move somewhere else if the PJ allowed that. ADFA has put in place that all tenants who are receiving TBRA from ADFA's home funds will have to maintain a residency within the state of Arkansas. Generally, portability of that assistance will not be outside of that recipient's jurisdiction. So if we have a city that is running a tenant-based rental assistance, they would be eligible to use this assistance within another unit within that city, but they could not move and take that assistance with them outside of that jurisdiction, except under the following circumstances. If we have a tenant that's relocating to accept employment, or they're getting some training that will lead to employment, in that case, we could allow that they would be allowed to essentially use the one city's TBRA funding that they're using and relocate outside of that city in these cases. The recipient would have to document the basis for granting that exception to this rule. The unit that they move to would have to, of course, be inspected to make sure that it met our property standards, and there will be a continuing responsibility for recertification of income. So let's talk a little bit about the property standards that apply. So under our tenant-based rental assistance, the property standard is Section 8 Housing Quality Standards. And that's the standard that our public housing agencies are utilizing, so it makes sense for the home program to specify the same standard. So a recipient that's running that tenant-based rental program will need to inspect any of the units that they're going to assist with and make sure that they meet those standards. The recipient will also, as part of their program design, have to have an occupancy standard in place. So that's, the minimum size of a unit for a specific number of folks to be able to occupy. So if I have a 5-person household, then there are going to be standards about how large of a unit they would need. So ADFA has kind of simplified this by saying you need to go ahead and adopt the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program's occupancy standard. So you don't have to create one, you can adopt the Section 8 standards. Also keep in mind that as part of that property standards also include the lead-based paint requirements. Now, For HQS, that is a visual assessment. So we're looking to see whether there are chipping, peeling, non-stable surfaces in those units, and those would have to be addressed for that unit to be able to meet the Section 8 HQS requirements. As far as the lease requirements, the owner's lease cannot contain any of the prohibited lease provisions that we mentioned in the rental section. That lease is going to be for a one-year term unless it's been mutually agreed upon between the tenant and the owner. That local program may have set some standards on that, whether they will allow some alternative on that. HUD does have requirements in place about termination or when you would choose to not renew the assistance, since we talked about it's a one-year renewal. And so ADFA requires that each of the recipients that are running these programs have those standards in place. They need to be in writing. They need to be included in that contract that they have with that household that's going to receive TBRA. So they understand what the terms and conditions would be that would lead to their losing their benefits under tenant-based rental assistance. If you have a tenant that is evicted by that property owner for cause, so, non-payment or some other violation of their lease agreements, then your tenant assistance would be terminated for that household. Now we're going to talk about how we calculate the level of assistance that's going to be provided to that household. So some of the factors that we're going to be evaluating as part of this is the household's income. So really looking at what is going to be affordable for them to pay their share of the cost. We're also going to be setting a standard in place of what we think a reasonable unit is as far as costs, and then looking at the cost of housing and utilities. So ADFA has specifically selected that the ADFA TBRA programs are going to follow the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. This works well since our recipients who are running these programs are typically a public housing entity. So the way we establish a payment standard, or what we consider to be a reasonable cost within that market for a particular size of unit, HUD itself has two options. We could do look at local market conditions using a market study, or we could look to the Section 8 fair market rents and then do a comparison of that. So ADFA has determined that for their programs that we're going to use the Section 8 fair market rents as our payment standard. We're going to compare our market rents to that Section 8 fair market rent level to determine whether we believe it is reasonable. There is the ability, and so what we've set as our payment standard needs to be between 80 and 100% of the fair market rent. So we might look at that Section 8 fair market rent for my particular community and determine that we feel that's slightly high. So we might set it as, maybe 90% of what the fair market rent is according to the Section 8 schedule. There is the ability on a unit-by-unit basis to grant an exception rent, and that would be for up to 20% of the tenant-based rental assistance. And this would allow you to go slightly over the fair market rent schedule if needed. The maximum on that is 110%. So each recipient running a tenant-based rental assistance program will have to document their comparability study in looking at market rates versus Section 8, and essentially have a basis to be able to show how they set their payment standards in place. So that payment standard is going to be established by that recipient, the entity that's running the TBRA program. It's going to be in place for all of the tenant-based rental assistance that's being provided through that portfolio, and it remains constant for the entire year. So it could be updated, reevaluated on an annual basis. So when we calculate the amount of the subsidy, there are some rules that play into that. So HUD requires that there be a minimum household payment that's going to be made. ADFA has put in place that there's a minimum of 30% of the household adjusted monthly income, and not to be less than $50. So at a minimum, everyone's going to be paying $50, but we're going to be calculating what's 30% of their household income. So what's affordable for them to be able to pay, and that is adjusted monthly income. If you were using the HUD income calculator that's online at the HUD Exchange, that will help you through this calculation of the adjusted monthly income. So our maximum subsidy is going to be set by our payment standard, what we determine to be a reasonable rent, minus what that household has the ability to affordably pay. And we set that at 30% of their household adjusted income. We'll talk about there are exceptions in the end based on the choice of unit that tenant may select. They might actually choose to live in a unit that they were paying more than 30%, but the way we determine our level of assistance is going to be based on our payment standard minus this 30%. Assistance can pay for up to 100% of a reasonable security deposit or utility deposit, and our security deposit, the maximum is 2 months worth of rent. HUD itself provides two models, a certificate model, which is essentially an older model under HUD, and then the housing choice voucher model. ADFA is using a designated, they're going to use the housing choice voucher model only. So the housing choice voucher model assistance, the way our calculation is made is that payment standard minus that 30%, and that assistance payment is going to be constant. So we're going to make that calculation the same level of payment will be received on a monthly basis throughout the term of that agreement, which is 1 year. When we re-verify income, we're going to reevaluate this, and with that next agreement, based on changes in income or rent levels, we would set what the level of that assistance would be. So the household payment's going to vary based on the unit that the household actually chooses, and we'll show you some examples of that, but the upper limit on that is capped at 42%. The concern is that even if a household is given the choice and is able to choose a slightly more expensive unit, if it goes over 42% of their household income, they probably are not going to be able to be stable in that unit. They'll really be at risk because they're paying so much of their household income towards maintaining housing. So the total payments, including the tenant, the tenant payment, the 30%, and the payment standard, may exceed that payment standard. So if we've set that our payment standard for a 2-bedroom unit is $600 a month, a household can choose a unit that's more expensive than that. We're still going to make the same level of payment, and they're going to be responsible for the difference. So it's where this housing choice approach comes in, that the household has more control about where they want to live. And there may be some compelling reasons that it makes sense for that household to choose a slightly more expensive unit, might be closer to work, to school, and fit better with that household's needs. So we're going to follow through this formula. So the PJ is going to set this maximum PJ payment, and it's going to be based on our payment standard minus 30% for that household payment. That's going to determine what their tenant rent payment is going to be. And we'll go through some examples for you to get comfortable on this. So in this example, the voucher model example, the payment standard has been set at $1,100. In this case, the household selected a unit that's actually cheaper than that. They were able to find a $950 a month rent rather than what was expected at the $1,100. They have an adjusted income of $32,500, and the utilities that are going to be tenant paid are going to be $50. So let's, in figuring out what the TBRA payment's going to be, what the household's going to pay, and their rent payment. Let's go to the next slide and we'll see that. So our first thing in doing is figuring out, we know that our household's going to be required to pay at least 30% of their household income. So if we divide their annual income into a monthly amount, the 2708, and then we calculated what would 30% of that be, we're saying that that household can afford to pay $812 a month, being within that 30% of their adjusted monthly income. So our payment standard was $1,100. They can afford to pay $812. So the difference, that subsidy that's needed, is $288. Now in this case, this family actually found a better deal on a rent. We're still going to pay the benefit that we calculated based on our payment standard. So when the rent is $950 and the program is paying $288, this household, in fact, is only paying $662 for rent, as opposed to the $812 that we calculated that they could afford at 30%. So the household is benefiting from making this wise choice, finding a better deal in the market. So in this case, their total payment's going to be their rent payment of $662, which is what the remaining rent is after our TBRA subsidy limit. And then we know that they're responsible for $50 in utilities. So that gives us a total for that household rent and utilities of $712 that they're going to be paying. Let's look at another example. So same household, same income, but in this case, the unit that they've selected to rent is actually more expensive than our payment standard. So we're going to follow the same calculation to determine what the benefit is, and let's look at the impact of that. So the program is still using the payment standard, still using the income, determining that what the program is going to pay, what the TBRA subsidy amount is going to be $288, same as we talked about before. In this case, that tenant's chosen a more expensive unit. So when we back out of that, the $288 benefit, this household's actually going to pay $912. So that's more than what 30% of their household income would be. And we said that that's allowable as long as it doesn't exceed 42% of their household income. So their total payment with rent and utilities is going to be $962. So this is part of the choice that we set a standard not specific to the unit that they have rented, and so they either benefit or they bear the consequences based on the unit that they actually select. So as far as running our TBRA program, so the subsidy contracts with the household cannot go beyond 2 years, but they need to annually be updated because we're going to renew income and reevaluate the subsidy levels when we do our income on that. They can be renewed, so just because the contract itself cannot exceed 2 years does not mean that after 2 years we couldn't then execute a new agreement for another 2 years. As we mentioned, we're hoping that our households will not be long-term on the program, but will be able to move into some more permanent sorts of funding. The administration of tenant-based rental assistance, unlike some of our other programs, there is not the ability to charge off project-related soft costs, and so it must be charged to administration. The only variance on this, and what ADFA has done with this, is said for TBRA administration, they will provide $120 per tenant for processing that tenant application, and then $20 per tenant for ongoing administrative expenses. And this is going to be capped at the total amount that was actually requested within that funding application with ADFA. Forms that are related to administering this program. We have a TBRA program application. There's a setup report, and we're going to be talking later about IDIF and the information that ADFA is collecting that they're going to report back to HUD through the IDIF system. And so the setup report gets completed by the recipient for each of those households to provide that information. I mentioned before that environmental review is required, and so our environmental certification form has been provided for TBRA. There is a admin fee request form, which the recipient would request reimbursement on. And then there's a program payment certification voucher form and a TVRA voucher request form that would be utilized as part of requesting and receiving payment. Keep in mind that the affirmative marketing fair housing plan would apply to your tenant-based rental assistance program, and that would be part of your files for this program.